So in this video, I'm going to go over home networking basics. It's going to cover router, modem, switch, and a few other devices. So the purpose of this video is to have you set up your home network just the same way that your network is set in your business. And this is designed to prevent hacking and other compromises that can happen from your neighbors, somebody who's driving down the street, or maybe somebody that you invite over, or or an unexpected guest who may have done some things to your network you didn't know about. There's a lot of trust that issues we may not have with our cable company, our telephone company, and there are a lot of good reasons for that. There's also some people that I think probably trust a lot of other tech companies like Geek Squad, for example, and a few others out there that while they sell you the product, they try to do the best that they can to set up the device. They may not necessarily be certified in some way by the manufacturer or some of the certification programs that are out there to do what they're doing. But at the same time, if there's a disgruntled employee, how do you know they don't have any of your information in there that they can use against you too? And that can happen. Sometimes it's best to regard these companies as a lawsuit waiting to happen. One of the reasons for this series is to show you how to use remote access through your own network system that you set up, so you can also control your devices through VPN, SSH, remote desktop, using Microsoft and another program for remote desktop purposes for Linux systems called VNC. And some of this you may already be doing through an app, say through security systems already, and the purpose of this is to go a little bit more deeper into this so that you can actually see that if you have other computer devices in your house, there are some ways that you can control them securely, as well as at the same time, if you're in a Wi-Fi environment, in a public way, that there are some ways you can actually control that, and we're going to touch on some of the virtual private network or VPN systems that we're covering in this series today. This series today is going to be focusing on two things. A modem. Now, a modem can be either used for cable, digital subscriber line, also known as DSL purposes, that you use for a phone company, as well as a router. For this particular series, they're going to be treated as two separate devices, and you'll see in the video series why that is. There are some ways, though, that you can purchase them as one device. So the question comes up, should you trust your internet service provider when renting their equipment? Well, the answer to that is no. And I'm going to go over in the next few sets of slides as to why that is. When you see those commercials on television, keep in mind that a lot of the services that are providing may be providing a service for you, but most of their products are designed to benefit themselves. To control your home network requires using your own equipment. So if you want a security system, you don't necessarily have to run to your cable provider or your phone company to get one. You can get one on Amazon. You can get one at Lowe's. And it makes it a lot easier to use your own home networking equipment to do this, as well as saving the rental fees that may be required by the company you get your equipment from. One difference with a lot of the routers that you can buy in the store, whether you get them from Netgear, Cisco, Linksys, is that they have their own microprocessor in them. And by having their own microprocessor within their networking equipment, you're capable of managing more devices. You can also have the option to have a media server, and you can also have the option of having a virtual private network or VPN. And again, we're going to show you later on the importance of what the VPN is all about. Now, this video isn't intended to be a complete network administration class like you'd see in a Network Plus or a Microsoft systems certification program. So this is some basics so that you will know how to control your own network. Now, if you're interested in doing this as a career or other options later on, there are some good programs that are working. In fact, right now I'm working on a Network Plus program with another company that has been very helpful about learning this setup, as well as Cisco equipment in the office. Now, because some of the networking equipment covered allows you to put in a portable hard drive, there is an option that you can run these as a file transfer protocol server. It is insecure and very dangerous to use. Now, there are some other ways that this series is going to show that you can use other alternatives that are going to be covered once we get through this video. And one of the ways these file server or file sharing systems are set up on these routers with the built-in hard drive covers something called BitTorrent. And this is something that's not going to be covered. They can be illegal to use, and is allowing others to download media that isn't created by you. And you can get into a lot of legal trouble if you ever do this. So this is not something that is going to be covered in this video, nor is it recommended. Now later on, this series is going to cover something called Secured File Transfer Protocol, and that will be something that will be done in a future class. Now this video will only address IPv4 protocol. Now some services used in this network aren't intended for IPv6. That's a little bit more of a complicated networking addressing, and a lot of printers and some other devices really don't work with that. So we're only going to stick with something that's very simple. And so not to get too technical with this here, it's going to be addressing only the IPv4 version. Now, in order to set up a network equipment, it is performed from any web browser on a computer. Now, if you have a Netgear Nighthawk series router, that equipment can also use the Netgear Nighthawk app to set up as well. Now, the cable DSL modem must be connected using a wired Ethernet connection to a computer to activate. Now, no other networking devices should be connected to the modem or the computer while this is happening, except for the coax or telephone cord that's coming from the wall into the modem. For demonstration example purposes, this video series is going to cover Netgear equipment. One of the reasons why I use this equipment is because it's designed not only for cable modem purposes but DSL purposes as well. And this company does make modems for both, unlike other manufacturers that are out there. And this will make it a lot easier to cover how this all works. So the first device that's going to be covered is the modem. Now, modem stands for modulator demodulator. This was a term that was used when these were being used to connect your telephone to, making all those strange beeping noises that you hear when you were getting on AOL or bulletin board service like I used to do in the 80s. And now that term is still here, but it's normally designed to identify an addressable device, as well as let the network know, whether it be cable or DSL, that hey, this is going to be a data device that I'm going to use to communicate over the internet. Now, the router is a very important piece on the network. This is a device that has the computer, delegates. Now, a router has a limited number of wired Ethernet connections, and usually has an unlimited number of wireless connections, some of which we've had up to 40 on our device. Now, one thing to consider with this device, especially with these really store-bought ones now because they have microprocessors in them, they're capable of handling a lot more wireless devices because of that processor in them. Some of these ones before these processors were coming up could only handle 18. So if you're having trouble getting a lot of devices to work with the stuff you're getting from your cable provider, this will take care of the problem. Most of these routers that you find in a store typically have wired connections and are limited to 5. 1 is going to be for the cable or the DSL modem, and 4 is going to be for their Ethernet devices. Now, if you need to plug in more devices, there's another way to do that, and that's through a switch. Now, wired connections are not a bad thing to have. They can certainly be used for speed and security purposes. And some of these routers nowadays definitely have ports, like your computers and your other devices, that can handle up to a gigabit. Now, there are some ways that the difference between wireless and wired speeds are changing, but even with these streaming devices, smart TVs, Rokus, and even Kindle Fires, some of these devices you can actually hook up as an Ethernet connection, and it's a lot more secure than to have it wireless. It may not be necessarily fast at the same time, as I know with the Fire TV ones that Amazon has are 100 megabit, but if you're concerned about somebody getting your network through a wireless connection through your TV. This won't happen in this case, because there have been some concerns recently, in a couple of years, with some Vizio products that happened a couple of years ago for these very reasons. Typically, these routers, again, will have wired Ethernet connections at 1 gigabit and wireless LAN at 100 megabit. And there's 2 different channels that we're going to cover that do that as well. There are some things that are going on out there now, especially with the new Netgear routers that are covering something called Wi-Fi 6. Now, there have been some people in the industry that have discredited the importance of that, because there are very few devices that are using that signal, and there are some other standards that are on the way that may make that standard less important or obsolete within the next few years. But typically, these are the 2 that you should focus on, because these 2 types of protocols for connecting to a network are made for most devices that you can buy or that are in your possession at this time. Now, there's sometimes the 4 Ethernet ports in the back are not going to be enough for wired connections, and if that's the case, that's what a switch is for. In the old days, there was something that was used called a hub, and the reason why we don't use hubs so much anymore is because they repeat the signals to all the devices, and they were known for having data collisions. Now, a switch is actually a smart enough device where it knows what computer you have, what address you have, and it knows exactly how to route the traffic from your router from the switch into your device. And we use a lot of these in the house as well, and I hate to do a lot of pitching for Netgear, but I do cover Netgear a lot, because it is easily accessible equipment that you can get anywhere. But they do make a great switch. Some of them we have in the house now run anywhere from 8 to 16 ports that we use for a lot of different applications, including running this website. There's 2 different types of switches that are available. One is an unmanaged switch, and one is a managed switch. An unmanaged switch doesn't have any software that you can control once it's plugged into your router. What the router does, though, when it sees the devices, it works together and makes sure that the same addresses that work with the network are assigned. Now, with a managed switch, a lot of times you may not need this in your home unless there's some really specific things you're doing in the way of hosting websites, services, well, even not necessarily for your home, but your business as well. Because with a managed switch, there are some ways that you can take and assign things such as 2 Ethernet ports to function to run websites. That way you increase the traffic. It's called aggregate switches. I'm not really going to get involved in a lot of this with this video. It gets into a lot of complicated mumbo jumbo, but if you want to save some money and you're not really doing a lot of specific things where you're getting a lot of internet traffic in, you're probably better off just going with the unmanaged switch than a managed switch. Now the next question comes up about a combined router and modem in the same device. And a lot of people do that just to save money. There are some good things about it, and there are a lot of bad things about it. Now, a few years ago, I was using a DSL modem within the router. And what I found out after a while, when CenturyLink decided to upgrade my service, that required a VDSL modem versus an ADSL modem, something you have to be mindful of when you buy these modems. So because the modem had an ADSL and needed VDSL, that had to be shut off, and I had to use their equipment temporarily before I bought new equipment. So sometimes if you need to upgrade if you're interested in upgrading your service, you may find that it's a lot cheaper just to get the modem, because it's easier to switch the modem out than it is to switch the modem and the router out of the same device. So you may not necessarily be saving money if you have some concerns of upgrading your bandwidth later on. Now, typically, a router, since it's the device that assigns the IP addresses, is going to have a default address that looks somewhat like this. Some of the numbering might be a little bit different, but most of the time it's either going to have a 1 at the end of the number. And that's kind of what I want to cover about how this works, because when we get the modem tied to it, this number should actually change so that the modem is assigned the device ending in 1 and the router becomes 2. And I'm going to kind of show you in this next example as to why that is. So this is a typical network situation that may happen in your house. Now, some of this, depending on whether or not you're using Comcast, CenturyLink, Frontier, or Charter, you'll have something like this. Sometimes you might be using two companies to do it. Sometimes you might be using one company to do all this. Doesn't matter whether the whole system is run by the phone company, cable company, or both. Typically, this is the type of equipment that you would have. So, for example, if that splitter that's up in the upper left corner there, it may also reflect a splitter that might be for a phone line if you're tying a television and a DSL modem into the system. If you're using cable for everything, it would just be a simple splitter to use. Now, you got to be careful when you use a lot of these splitters. Make sure they're intended for the right purposes, because not all splitters are equal. So it's always a good idea, if you're going to be using them, to go with the ones that the phone company recommends. That you should get from them, or at least get some advice from them on which one to use. Now, this also demonstrates, too, that by having a splitter, in this case, we're separating the TV from the data. Now, sometimes that can be blurred. Now, sometimes when you're using line or wired phones in your house, if you're going through the cable company, whether it be Charter or Xfinity, a lot of times those phone lines are going to be tied into the cable modem. Sometimes if you're using their equipment, it's going to be tied to the router. Now, there are modems that you can buy out there that will do that purpose if that's something you do need. And keep in mind, with this one, you don't necessarily have to have the same modem manufacturer as you do for the router. I use ARRIS in the house, or it's called ARRIS. And that is one that Comcast uses, and there are some models that they do make that do provide two lines for telephone service. You can do that. Sometimes with these systems, too, if you're using a DSL service, you're going to put a filter, and the filter is typically going to go into a splitter or some wall outlet that's going to allow the system to know that I'm a telephone and I'm not data, so that way it can handle your voice calls and separates the voice from the data traffic. That's what they're intended to do. Now, also in this case, you'll also see here that the cable box also has an Ethernet line to it. And this can happen if you have TiVo devices because they do rely on internet connections to update the programming on a weekly basis or a daily basis. Now, while this network diagram in a typical home shows roughly the same pictures as the other two slides did, what this does have is it actually has the IP addresses that are assigned by the router once the whole system is in place. And many people think this might be really difficult to do, but if you've been on the internet for a long time, and I know there's a few people that don't feel comfortable with it, but come on, this has been technology that's been around for 30 years. It should be something you should be comfortable with by now. You're going to see in these slides, it's just a matter of typing in that same IP address that on a web browser that came with the router, and it's either written on the router or written in the graphical instructions. And these instruction manuals are very easy to use these days, so that once you enter that address in, all this stuff should automatically set up on its own. So now that all the big picture demonstrations have been taken care of, we're going to start from the beginning about how this works. So the first thing you want to do is make sure you take the cable modem out of the box, plug the coax or DSL or phone line in, and into from the wall, whichever one you're using. And by the way, I think I might have to do something about the DSL, because there's actually a better phone cable out there that you can get that I was using from Belkin that's out there, and some of the other ones that may help with the bandwidth. Let's see if I can get a slide for it, put it up on the website. Once you have the Ethernet connected into a computer, and make sure you have it tied into a computer that you can use, whether it be a notebook or a regular desktop computer. Leave the power on for about 2 minutes. Now, one thing you are going to have to do right away is contact the cable internet service provider or your DSL company to make sure that the device has been registered, since it is addressable to work with the service. Now, unless you're buying these devices from eBay, you should already have an Ethernet cord and a telephone cord and a coax cord to use if you do need them. Some of the coax cords actually even come with a wrench, so you can even make sure it's secured to the wall. The coax is tied to the wall, as well as the cable modem, and that's awesome. And like I say, some of the telephone cords that come with these devices may seem a bit flimsy, and there are some ones that I'm going to put up on the website just to put a picture of to show you. There is a better shielded cable that you can use from the wall into the DSL modem, and it actually may improve your bandwidth performance. Now, once these have been hooked up and they've been powered on for about 2 minutes, you want to make sure you contact your internet service provider to register the device. CenturyLink will also provide you a user ID and password to enter the info into the modem to get it to work. Now, that is typically done when you first sign up for the service. If you are using one of their products in the interim, they'll have that in there. Make sure you get that on a separate piece of paper and put it in a safe somewhere, because you're going to need that for whatever device you're going to be using in the house. Typically, if you're using a cable modem, they don't need a user ID and password. There may be a few exceptions to that rule, but most of the time for Comcast and Spectrum, you're going to plug it in, wait 2 minutes, and call them, give them the serial number or the device ID that they're looking for from the device. They'll register it, and you should be up and running within 5 to 10 minutes. It may take a little bit longer to get it on the network, but make sure you follow the light patterns on there to see what's happening. As long as it looks like, normally they use green and blue lights, so that hopefully they look the same thing that they tell you in the book. Now, the instructions on how to set these up are very easy. You may laugh and think, Tim, you're full of crap about this here, but trust me, this is not some of the stuff that I had to do in the 80s and 90s when I set this up. And you should be blessed that you didn't have to mess with EEPROMs and all of that garbage. But typically these things are designed like a web server by you accessing a web browser. Now, that seems scary, but it's secured. Nobody's going to get into it out from the outside, unless you want them to. But I'm hopefully listening to this video, you will not. But as long as you follow the instructions, there are PowerPoints that if you go to the manufacturer's website that you can follow. Some of them even have YouTube videos as well. For the purpose of this video, though, I don't really want to focus on one particular product, because some of them have some similarities, some of them don't, and it can really save you a lot of confusion just by letting you know to read the manual, follow the brochures. They're very easy to use. I know they have done a lot of work on making sure that they can be used for everybody. You don't have to be a techie to follow them. Now, the important thing you want to do once you set up the router is make sure you change the default password. To give an example of what happens with these devices on Netgear's end is most of the time when you get the devices, the user ID is going to be administrator or admin, and the password is going to be password. Now, during the setup process, by the way, which is easy to do, once everything is plugged in and knows it's your first time around, Netgear's actually going to go through the trouble of finding everything on your network and setting it up on the screen. Usually typically takes about 5 to 10 minutes to do. But after the process is done, it's going to have you change that default password. Make sure you remember what it is. Next thing we're going to cover, once the router is up and running, we definitely want to get that Wi-Fi working. And the best way to do that is follow the setup instructions on the router on how to do that. They're usually pretty clear by selecting the Wi-Fi setup. Now, most routers have 2 or 4 bands. Now, those are 4 separate channels or signals that are distinct for your home or your office. Now, a lot of times these can be used as to separate 4 different bands, because if you're using wireless N, for example, some of them will run on a 2.4 gigahertz signal and some run on a 5 gigahertz signal. Now, some have a preference to using the 5 gigahertz signal for doing streaming, video streaming, especially for high def, and that's great. It's just that the coverage for that signal doesn't really have the same strength as 2.4 gigahertz does. It's more of a common occurrence with wireless end devices to have 2.4 And sometimes there are a lot of devices out there that have 5 gigahertz as well. So if you see anything that says dual band, that's what that means. But I like to think and tell people that the difference between 2.4 and 5 gigahertz is a lot like how AM signals work and FM signals work in terms of strength and how far they can travel to get to a device. Now again, most of these routers that we're covering here are 2 bands for household use, 2 bands for guest use. Most of the time they're all going to still be wireless in. Most of the household devices stay separate from the network that the guests do. And the reason is that when we have a lot of these Ethernet devices, particularly in a Windows network or a domain controller setting or some work group or shared setting, the guest devices are not allowed to be on that same network so that they do not have access to that data. So if you're concerned about keeping your network secure, it's best to stick with those rules. Now when you're setting up a wireless network, setting the household and guest passwords with different encrypted passwords, they should both follow the WPA2-PSK AES standards. This will work with most devices. There are some other ones you're going to see in there, but they may not necessarily work for phones, tablets, and other wireless devices. This is an encrypted connection that helps and has most coverage for specific devices. There are a few other ones that we're probably going to cover in just a few seconds here that may not apply to this rule. And this is going to seem redundant, but make sure the guests are not able to connect to devices on the household network. And I don't know if I said this earlier or not, but I also make sure too that the 2 bands that you can use for both networks, they keep the same password. So the household password is the same for both the 2.4 and the 5 gigahertz, and the guest password is the same for the 2.4 and the 5 gigahertz guest network as well. It's just that the guest password and the household password are unique. There's some cases where you may need to have a Wi-Fi extender because the signal just doesn't go from one end of the house to the other. We have one. It looks a lot like this. Now, make sure when you use these, whatever manufacturer your router is, the manufacturer should be the same for the extender. It's going to do 2 things. One, it's going to help you to not worry about security on your network, because if they're not the same manufacturer, some of the security on your network will be degraded. And the other nice thing that these extenders do too is they also help clean up a lot of the password concerns that may be going on with the guest passwords, your password, and they will also help with the security of them because they are all going to follow the same configuration so that as you go from one end of the house to the other, the extender will know when to kick in and the router will know when to kick in as well. So one of the goals of this series is to get you to set up a unique name to get into your network. And how that unique name is going to work is going to be covered in a few slides here soon. But some of that is going to be determined by a couple of other factors on how your network is set up. Now, your cable company or your telephone company has 2 ways that an address can be assigned. There's static IP, which means they provide typically an IPv4 address that never changes. As long as you're paying the bill with them, you're going to keep that same address. Now there's one that many have called a static IP. There's some nice things about a static IP because it changes all the time. So you don't have to worry about a neighbor or some hacker knowing that same address and know they can get into all your goodies at home because that number is going to change. But because that number changes, it makes it a bit difficult that if we are trying to use outside resources to get into your network, like say a telephone, to get into your computer equipment to access a file, we have to have a name and that name has to have the same resources to know that when those changes are made to your network, they're updated when you use that name. And these routers, because of the microprocessors and the software in them, they're capable of knowing that once we get this tied to the service, which is known as the domain name service. So how this works, again, your cable or your telephone companies may provide you a static IP address that might look something like this. Now, typically with static IP addresses, they're normally more expensive to have on your network than they are to have a dynamic IP address. And a lot of times when you have a static IP address, you're regarded as a business account. And your bill can go up a lot with Comcast if you tell them you need one, because once you do that, that's going to be a red flag for them to put you on the business account. Now with the dynamic IP address, this kind of shows an example of how this works. A lot of rural areas, it doesn't necessarily change as much. I notice more than it does in urban areas. So Monday, you might have this address on your router when you get up in the morning, but by Tuesday, it may change. So it's important to have a service available that can monitor this, which we're going to go over here very shortly. The best way to describe how a domain works when it's tied to an IP address is this website, timbabcock.net. Now, timbabcock.net is a name that is tied to a domain name service, in this case, register.com. And register.com has this name that I pay an annual fee for to use. And register.com needs to know what address that name is going to point to. Now, this isn't the address for the website, but I just put this in here so that this way, if you need to go into timbabcock.net, you weren't going to need to type in 72.68.123.89. And what makes it even more confusing with a dynamic IP address, because it changes, this address may not be the same within the next 5 minutes. So just to reiterate again, if timbabcock.net is running on a dynamic IP, that IP address is going to change. So not only is it important when this happens that Tim Babcock has a domain name tied to a service, but that service also has to be able to monitor the IP address for those changes by talking to the router. And this is what we're going to talk about next. Now, there are a couple of different dynamic name service providers that are available. Wherever the settings are in your router to control that, make sure you use the ones that they have and that are recommended, because they're going to work with the router to keep them monitored. These are two that Netgear works with. Netgear also has their own as well. However, I have not used that, but dyndns.org is a very popular one I've used for 20 years now. It is owned by Oracle, and they do use their database systems to keep an eye on that. Now, there was one I was using a few years ago called noip.com. It's free. There is some hoops that you do have to do to get that, because as I tell you in this industry, there is no such thing as a free lunch. So if you don't go through those hoops, you're going to get into trouble if you do use their service. It's going to make a big mess. So the fees are actually pretty reasonable for some of these sites and services. You might want to shop around a little bit, but usually these things should either give you 2 or 3 choices as to what to use. So again, just a reminder that a domain name service provider provides a name for your network and monitors IP address changes, so that if you need to get in that security camera in your doorbell, you have a name to do it rather than an address. Now again, when you use the service, make sure you follow the recommended services your router uses to prevent installing memory resident programs to monitor the services, because some of these you can do, and some of them you may want to be careful of doing as well, because you're opening up more firewall ports. Now, to cover how this works, we're going to assign a domain name that we're going to be using for a virtual private network, and this is something we're going to cover in an additional video as well in the future. Now, I know it seems a bit crazy with all the stuff we're expecting our router to do, and this is why a lot of these things are more important to have a processor in them these days. But the router will manage domain name services and IP address changes on top of everything else that it has to do. Now, another thing your router do that your internet service provider probably doesn't even want you to know about is that some of these routers can be used as a media server. And how that works is you want to make sure you turn it off before you do this, but you can plug a Western digital router that has all your pictures, your music, and your videos. Sometimes you can get these from your camera, and that is all copied through some managed way. Hopefully it's through folders, so everything's all separated. Once you plug that in, you'll enable it. The device will know that that it's on there. And a lot of these Netgear routers do a great service of being able to even map everything in there, so that when you use it to other devices such as your Roku, your TiVo, or some of your streaming devices, you'll actually be able to use them. The VLS is another program that we'll be using too as well. I don't really want to spend a lot of time on this because there's actually going to be another video that's going to show how you can make one that's separate from your router or your networking equipment that may work a little bit more efficiently than using your router to do. There's very few things we have to set up in here to get a lot of features going that I'm going to be covering in this video series. But one we do have to pay attention to is something called the MTU, also known as the maximum transmission unit. It's typically in the advanced settings of your router. This tells a router how big the protocol data unit can be. Now, sometimes when you set this equipment up, particularly I noticed with CenturyLink, it may not work right away because this hasn't been set. I found this out the hard way a few years ago when I was working with CenturyLink's equipment on my own DSL modem. Wasn't able to get into it, so I found out that I had to set this in a router. So typically for a lot of DSL connections, that number, while the default is 1500, it's fine for cable. It does have to be lowered down to 1492. And there's some other quirky things that you can Google about to find out if there's a way that you can tweak it a little bit more. But if you're having trouble using the service, that's the number you want to go with. Now, for this video, we're also going to be covering the VPN, or virtual private network settings, and because we're doing that, we have to even lower it a little bit more. So in this case that we're using at home right now, since we have a VPN, we're going to take it down to the 1436. So by covering what we're working with now, all of what we've done so far covers this whole purpose of data responsibility. And that's we're going to use this network equipment to set up a virtual private network, which is one thing the router can do. And it's pretty nice about how it does it because it sets up all your encryption keys, your certificate, and all the settings. All of this stuff will get transferred through your phone using a special app. And by connecting your phone to the virtual private network, you're able to get into your router. And not only can you get a router that puts you in, you can use the internet off your router from your phone to get into websites and various services that you need. You can also use it for data purposes as well, which is something I'm going to cover later on in another video when we get into tunneling. But for now, I'm going to kind of show you how you can use this so that you're not on the same network when you're in a public area if you were going into Starbucks. Now, by using a public Wi-Fi network, while you're connected to the routers through your phone, and you can do this either wireless or over the regular cell phone wireless towers, you're cloaking or changing your IP address so that you're not on the same network as all the other devices are that are at the Starbucks or any other public place you go, whether it be the library, the grocery store, or anywhere there is a public Wi-Fi network. Now, one of the nice things about a virtual private network is that the IP addresses, remember those were those numbers that we've covered up a couple slides ago for the VPN services, are in the range that your network router uses. You're not in the same network that the Starbucks computer is that's across the table from you. And while you can use their service to get into the internet, at the same time, you're also tied into your own network so that your address is cloaked. Just to show you an example how this works, you can kind of see if you were at Starbucks, you might have an address if you were on their network that would be tied with this. But if you were in the Starbucks using their Wi-Fi network tied to your VPN, you might have an address that might look like this. And in some ways, it's even more encrypted because you are also tied to an encryption key, which has a very lengthy security protocol in it that is going to make it tough for that table next door over for you to even get into your computer under any circumstances. Remember that domain name that we talked about a few slides ago? Well, that's going to be the name that we're going to use to connect to this VPN or virtual private network service. Now, when the VPN service is activated, using the advanced settings, the security certificate and key they're going to be using within your mobile phone or other device is going to be generated by the router, as well as the firewall ports. Now, at the Netgear and the OpenVPN system that's on their networking equipment, there's three types of certificates that are created. One is going to be for Windows, one is going to be for non-Windows, and this can be used for Apple or iOS devices as well as Linux. And then there was a third certificate that's created for Android devices. Now, the files that are generated by the router should be transferred to a flash drive or cloud storage for backup purposes. Because whatever device you're going to use, you're going to go take that zip folder out, unzip them, and use them for the OpenVPN app, which we're going to cover here in just a moment. Now, the next thing you want to do from your phone, if you have an iPhone or an Android device, you want to download the OpenVPN app from the App Store. It is free, and the reason why we're using OpenVPN is not only is it built into Netgear routers and equipment, but it is also available for free on the current operating system version of Windows 10, as well as Windows Server 2019. Now, in a work setting, there might be some other VPN systems that you work with, and hopefully, now that we're working in homes with COVID-19, you are using one. Because if your employer is using one and you're working from home, that's really playing with fire. And hopefully, if they don't have one, they're watching this video, and I would encourage them to do so if they are, if they don't have one. But this system is a great one to use. You can really work within a family in a small business setting, and it's free. And a lot of these videos are going to cover later on about how this works in other ways as well. Once you have it installed on your phone, you want to go into the OpenVPN app and select the plus button that you'll see typically it's in the lower right hand corner, and select Import Files. Now, before you get into the plus sign, you also want to make sure too that the certificates from the router are copied over into the phone somehow. And then once that's been selected, everything should import in perfectly, and then VPN can be activated from the settings using the OpenVPN app. Now, in a later video, I'm going to cover how OpenVPN can work with other computer devices, including building a tunnel. And you're going to find out the importance of that later on. There are some good resources to find out how OpenVPN works using the OpenVPN website. There are some YouTube videos. Again, this is a free service. One thing you're going to notice too on the settings is that the domain name that you used to name your network should be in the settings of the OpenVPN. And once everything's connected, the domain name service worked, it connects to your router, and everything should be fine, and you should be working out of a very secured environment that you really won't have to worry about. Just a few tips to use the support section of the network equipment manufacturer's website. Make sure that all network equipment is registered, and update the firmware as needed on the router. Most of the time with Netgear, you'll probably get one set when you first set it up. That will definitely help with any security flaws and make setting up and using your router much easier. Now, most router manufacturers are going to have some sort of app that you can use to set up or monitor and maintain the devices. This isn't something that is just tied to Xfinity devices. Netgear's been using it for years. Probably have the patents to it. So make sure you get those resources. And just a reminder that for these videos, you can use any modem. If you're using any DSL modem, any cable modem will work with this system. It doesn't have to be tied to the same manufacturer as your router is. But keep in mind the router and the Wi-Fi extenders should be from the same equipment manufacturer. Now, switches don't need to be from the same manufacturer. You can use any one you wish. Well, I want to thank you for paying attention to this video here, and I hope I gave you some good information here. I was not planning on doing a 45-minute video, and I promise you that some of the other ones that are going to be done on the website or in the future aren't going to be this long, but there was a lot of very important information that did have to be covered on here. If you have any questions about this video or any other questions you need to shoot over me, you can always use the website timbabcock.net and use the web form to do that. And I want to thank you again for listening to me, and you have a good day.